Hi everyone, welcome back. So this is S6 Political Science. It's a continuation of our discussion of regionalism. In the previous recording, we talked about the types of regionalism. Types in terms of, first of all, how you define a region. You define a region in two ways. There are two approaches. One, in terms of geography, and secondly, in terms of shared cultures, beliefs, values, and ideals. And then there's also another way of classifying regionalism in terms of the aims of those nation states that decide to come together to form an organization. So you have security regionalism, economic regionalism, and political regionalism. And in this recording, we are going to focus on economic regionalism. If you remember, some would say that this is the primary form that regionalism has taken in recent years or decades. And there are many who point to European regionalism as the model for this type of, um, you know, political association. So Europe has seen quite a not dramatic, but just unprecedented in the sense that we had not seen it before. If you look at the history of Europe, it's a history of you know um, of conflict. It's a history of power struggles. But then after the Second World War, you would have this unheard of, unseen process of integration involving the usual large powers on the continent. So of course we're talking about France, we're talking about Germany, um, traditional rivals before this point. So some have suggested that European integration provides a model of political organization that will eventually be accepted worldwide, as the deficiencies of the nation state become increasingly apparent. You know, you might agree with this, as people have um, singled out the European Union as a kind of model for, a supranational association of states. But at the same time, we saw before in previous discussions that the nation state has not really lost its relevance, its importance. In some ways, as no, in significant ways. Sorry, in significant ways, the EU there's in the EU there's still a lot of space for the nation state, for decision making that refers primarily or takes primarily the interests of the nation state, you know, um, into account. Now, how did this happen? How did this start? I know in your Essex history, you've talked about the First and the Second World Wars. And, when you're talking about the war, when you're talking about wars, there's always an economic aspect to war. There's always you can say an economic fallout after global conflicts. So, the Allied powers eventually uh, won the war over the Nazi regime. But at the same time, it didn't mean that all was well and good right after the fall of Berlin and the eventual surrender of all the allies of all the Axis powers. Sorry. So there was in Europe the need to reconstruct to rebuild the continent in economic terms. So this could only happen through cooperation. And as people saw eventually, that there was a necessity for the establishment of a larger market, and this market, this large market would have to be, in many ways harmonized, harmonized across borders, across countries. And of course, you have political motives as well. So Europeans finally become tired of war, and they saw the need to resolve the long-standing rivalry between France and Germany. This, if you remember, this goes all the way back to 1870, 1871, to the Franco-Prussian War, and which would play out in the First World War and as well as in the Second. So some people talk about the German question. What do you do with a superpower like Germany? Okay. And, more and more European leaders saw that, you know, one shouldn't isolate a power like Germany. That's not the way to go. Not, one shouldn't isolate it and let it feel threatened from all sides. Okay. Surrounded by, perceived uh, potential and actual enemies. So more and more people saw the greater need to integrate Germany into, a larger, a wider Europe. At the same time, since we're talking about the era after the Second World War, and you have the onset of the Cold War and the rise of the two great superpowers, the USSR on the one hand and the US on the other. So leaders in Europe, while they wanted economic recovery, they wanted to achieve a lasting peace. At the same time, they saw that they needed to create, or to find their own identity, their own path. That wasn't necessarily totally aligned with either um, the Soviet ideology and manner of political organization, or the American one. Okay. Of course, the US had a hand in this as well. Uh, US leaders wanted to see the reemergence of Europe. There were, of course, political motives behind this, as well as economic ones. So the US wanted Europe to recover because first it wanted Europeans to pay their debt. Okay, they also wanted the market for American goods, and at the same time, politically speaking, they wanted a kind of barrier, a kind of bulwark or fortress against, the growing influence of the USSR. So sometimes the best way to protect yourself is not to build walls around you right at your geographical borders, but, you know, build borders, fortresses, or barriers offshore somewhere else. Okay, at least that's the thinking. And then lastly, um, the nation state that was a product of uh, the late 19th century and the early 20th century. But then increasingly also at the same time, leaders and commentators, philosophers and thinkers, they started to see the deficiencies of the nation state. If the nation state is driven by, you know, a certain type of nationalism that uh, a nationalism that has tendencies towards confrontation, towards military action, then perhaps there was a need to think about, you know, other ways of relating to other countries or other people who didn't necessarily belong to your community. So there was an increasing awareness that perhaps international organizations have a higher moral authority over the state in the sense that international organizations would be able to check, and not only check but also have the moral standing to check the nation state, the tendencies of the nation state to think about uh, itself only, or to be aggressive in its foreign policy, for instance. So maybe there was a need for greater international cooperation. Maybe there was a need for bodies that go beyond the nation state. You know, political bodies that could make decisions well above mere national interest, for instance. Okay, in um, in the course of our considerations of regionalism, of course, maybe you see where this is going. We're actually headed towards a discussion of the European Union. So part of that will be a quick look at the history of the European Union, and a few points as to how the European Union came about. So it's a long process that's stretched and an ongoing one that stretched across decades. It wasn't just an instant decision, and there it was. It involved political will and decision making on the part of real decision making on the part of leaders and the different nation states to decide to come together and form this organization and promote greater and greater harmonization and integration.